Alright, so there is a portion of the Dress to Impress community that has been calling out Dress to Impress for alleged favoritism towards feminine presenting bodies and gender locking items so that certain male bodies cannot access items that they should have access to. And today we're going to talk about this because this is much more than just a pixelated item. It has to do with inclusivity and diversity and understanding the wide variety of players that play Dress to Impress. And I think this is a really valuable learning opportunity and some really genuine concerns that players have. And I hope that Dress to Impress can take these concerns and actually kind of alter their sort of system for, gender locking items to make it more inclusive to the wider community. Now, because this is a pretty kind of, sensitive video and there's a lot to discuss here, I will be using this Reddit thread because I thought this creator actually really well worded their opinion, as well as, just some basic facts that we should definitely talk about. Now, I do have to clarify this. Anytime I use a publicly posted comment, I have to clarify, this was posted publicly. There is no expectation of privacy when you post something publicly to the internet. However, I do blur usernames because I don't need people getting harassed for having an opinion. I don't think that's fair. However, I have seen people say that I need to ask for permission or I don't have a right to talk about what people say. However, this falls under fair use, and when you're using something or a comment that is, again, posted publicly for commentary or journalistic purposes, that falls under fair use, and I don't need anybody's permission to use it. So with that in mind, we have this comment that we're going to go over, and basically it reads, "The male model situation is absurd." And it shows basically a picture of the Dress to Impress advent calendar, and this original poster has highlighted 4 different items, one of which is this hat, then we have a sweater, and then 2 accessories. Now they go on to write, "I get not every item modeled for both rigs all the time throughout the year and for every update. But come on now, you tell me Dress to Impress couldn't not gender lock items for something as important as an advent calendar or New Year's? Out of the 13 non-currency /poses /walks that are available in the calendar, male models can only wear 4 of them, 2 of those being props. They heard from the newest New Year code, not even an option. Sorry, but this is just insane, especially considering 90% of the boutique items are also gender locked. It's not even that I'm asking for a male toggle for a ballroom dress or a bikini. Y'all literally locked the most genderless items in existence. Shoes, locked. Hair, locked. Necklaces, locked. Sleeves, locked. Capes, locked. It's just absurd at this point. It's not even just some random event, it's goddamn Christmas and New Year's. And people really expect Dress to Impress to deliver the plus-size rig when they can't even handle the male model properly. Won't even mention the update itself, which brought 0 new hairstyles compared to the female counterpart, which got 6+, and just 2 new clothing items, which were added after complaints of being gender locked. Now, for those that don't know, gender locked is basically the term that Dress to Impress players have been using to identify items that are, not eligible to be used on certain rigs. And of course, there are some items that only Masc players can use on Masc rigs, and there are some items that only feminine presenting players can use on the femme rigs. And that's fine, that's whatever. But I find what a lot of people use as justification for the disproportionate amount of, femme items that are, and I use femme and Masc kind of loosely here, but I'm just trying to differentiate between the 2 rigs. I understand that anybody can use either rig, but an excuse that I've seen a lot of players use for the femme rigs having significantly more items than the Masc rigs is that, well, it's a dress-up game. There's way more girls who play a dress-up game, so obviously they're going to have more female items, which I think is a really negative perception to be putting out there because it undermines the amount of different gender expressions and identities that actually play Dress to Impress. Although it is a dress-up game, and historically dress-up games have been more geared towards girls, I would like to highlight that Dress to Impress is a very diverse community, which includes individuals who are maybe Masc-presenting, who are non-binary, or maybe just female-presenting users who want to use a Masc body. And I think to favoritize a certain demographic, which is what a lot of people pointed this out as, I think is really unfair because it undermines the diversity of the community and how anybody should have the right and ability to use a different body if they want to use it for a certain theme or they just want to represent that way. Nobody should be forced into using a different body type because they don't have access to items that would be good for that theme, or they don't have access to items that are just, kind of genderless items that for some reason have been locked solely to the female rig. Now, I do want to clarify here that I understand that it's a lot of work to make items accessible for both rigs. And like this original poster, I don't think that necessarily ballroom dresses or certain items need to always be, interchangeable between the 2 rigs. But what I think is important to note here is that when you have stuff like capes or hairs even, I think it's unfortunate when you have hairs that are maybe longer, locked to only being for femme-presenting players, because it kind of undermines the fact that Masc-presenting players can have longer hair, or that maybe Masc-presenting players want to have certain hair types that females have. And I think it really just kind of is this unfair, which a lot of people have coined as favoritism from the Dress to Impress community, which I don't think is the intention here. I think this comes from maybe just not quite understanding how many players use Masc rigs and how many players, want to have access to a diverse library of items that are not locked to what gender you want to identify as. And I do think it's unfortunate when people seem to, try to portray this as, oh, well, there's more girls that play Dressed Impress, so we don't have to acknowledge the Masc presenting player base, which I think it's just very unfair and it doesn't make sense. Again, I understand it's a lot of work, obviously, to make items accessible for both kind of body types, because obviously you have to resize them, you have to edit them slightly, you have to make sure they fit the Masc head, you have to obviously work it with the different kind of animations and stuff like that. And so I'm not naive to the fact that that is probably a ton of work, right? I'm not trying to say, oh, snap my fingers and make it happen, right? But I think the lack of accessibility for Masc players to access items, especially part of a New Year's calendar or whatever Christmas calendar they have here, especially if you're accessing stuff that is maybe a premium tier, you're paying for stuff, you should certainly have the opportunity to use those items on different body types. Because if you're doing a sort of calendar and you're logging in every day and you're rightfully earning items, to have those items not be eligible to be used on your specific rig, I feel like it's a little bit unfair. And what this person highlighted with the, the updates of increased femme presenting hairs but not having any Masc hairs, again, I think kind of like dissuades people from using Masc bodies and Dressed Impress, when I think players shouldn't have to decide between the two because of how many items are accessible to a certain rig. They should be able to decide between the two rigs because they want to present as a specific rig. They shouldn't be forced to choose another one because they want to have access to certain items that have just been, gender locked for the other rig. Now, there is a lot of comments here that I think are pretty valid. This person says, at this point, they should just make all the items work for the male bodies. This person writes, they probably just assume that the amount of people that regularly use male bodies is small, so they don't want to put the amount of work it would take to make everything / most items fit on the male body. I would guess that a lot of them would be pretty hard to rig for the male body, but again, they have such a huge team now, it shouldn't be that big of an issue. Which, side note, and I know some people may not like this stance, which is fine, but I find it really disingenuous when a game is actively profiting either directly or indirectly from the sale of items and they can't be bothered to make it accessible for all of their players. With something like the Christmas calendar, even if you're doing maybe a free tier, you're not purchasing stuff in, Dressed Impress, that's fine, whatever. The game is still, profiting from you playing the game because you're joining, which encourages other players to join. If you have premium, they're getting paid for you to play the game and for the time you spend in the game. So regardless, Dressed Impress is profiting from you joining the game. That's how it works, right? And the more you play a game, the more likely you are to spend money on that game, maybe buying certain items and stuff like that. And so to say, oh, well, there just isn't a ton of Masc players, I think is an unfair stance, because it doesn't matter how many players are in a game or how many Masc presenting players there are. That doesn't mean they deserve to be overlooked. It doesn't mean that there should be a blatant favoritism in accordance to what some players are saying towards feminine presenting bodies just because they're the majority. That completely overlooks the diverse, background and player base of Dressed Impress, and I think that's really harmful. Just because somebody is a smaller portion of the player base does not mean that they don't deserve to have updates, they don't deserve to have access to items, and that they don't deserve to be recognized. I think it's a very toxic and harmful kind of perception to be spreading. Now, the original poster responded to that comment and said, yeah, that's exactly what they said on Discord. The thing is, though, that remodeling some items like gloves, capes, and necklaces take at most 30 minutes. They just don't care, low-key. If they really are on the no one uses them so why bother train of thought, then why the F did they add them in the first place? Hell, why did they announce another rig, plus size, which would obviously not beat the OG girl rig in usage percentage? That's what I'm saying. Like, this is a very valid point from this person, which I'm gonna be honest, I did not see the comment that they were saying they made in Discord, and I'm also not sure how they know if it would take 30 minutes. Maybe they have, experience modeling. I'm not sure. As someone who doesn't, I can't really speak to that. But I think it's really important to note here that Dressed Impress has been promising diverse body types, and I think part of the reason they added Masc bodies was because of a push from the public to, add more diversity to the game, which I think is really important for, obviously inclusivity and just representation, and especially when you have a game that is as influential as Dressed Impress, where you have so many young people playing your game, and you have one type of body type that is a very skinny, tall, generically beautiful female body in your game. It does kind of perpetuate this sort of narrative that you have to be tall and skinny to be beautiful, which I understand if you're like, oh, it's not that deep, but it is that deep when you have kids playing your game and them idolizing your game and the developers of that game, and a game can't be bothered, in my opinion, to make plus size bodies, which has been something that they promised for a while now, and they promised it when they were kind of in this sort of dramatic situation, like, hey guys, we're going to be doing plus size bodies, and they were getting feedback for it, and then all of a sudden radio silence. And then they were saying recently with the new community manager, they had made a post or something about what they're looking at right now. And they were talking about how it just isn't the top of the priority right now, but they're still looking into it, but they don't have any updates. So they were telling me they've had all this time to work on the plus size bodies and they haven't done anything with it. Meanwhile, Dressed Impress has no issue releasing additional updates that have to do with them making money, such as collabs, advent calendar, different tiers of certain battle passes and stuff like that. They have no issue doing stuff that makes them money. But when it comes to representation and, actually being accountable for the things that they have promise the community base, that doesn't matter. That can take as long as they need, which I think is a really unfortunate kind of stance for them to take, in my opinion. And of course, I can't necessarily go into their minds and read what they're thinking, but to me, it comes across disingenuous when you say you're going to be making plus size bodies, or you say you're going to be adding male rigs, and then you add a little bit, or you kind of tease a little bit to the community, and as soon as they stop talking about it, you immediately start moving on to things that make you money, because again, I understand that you're a business, but at the same time, you owe a duty of care to your player base, and if you promise them something and advertise they're going to be adding something, and then when they stop talking about it, all of a sudden you can just forget about it and start focusing on stuff that makes you money, it just comes across like a money grab. It comes across like a corporation. You want to think that a game that you're playing cares about you, and in my opinion, when they're kind of blatantly ignoring some of these updates that players have been begging for such a long time, it comes across as disingenuous and that they don't actually care, and that is just an opinion, it's not a fact, but I think it's an important thing to highlight here. And then we have another comment that this person writes, I mean, one of the VIP sets, the halter sweater one, was compatible with the Masc body from the beginning of the update before they did the same for the other sets, but I agree about the rest of this. At the very least, all the advent items should be compatible. It comes across as lazy for sure, which I'm not necessarily trying to, be mean in this situation or call anybody lazy, because again, I have no idea what goes into development. I'm not trying to sit here and act like I'm a pro at this or act like I could do any better, because I couldn't, and that's reality. I couldn't do nearly as good as half these developers, and I have a lot of respect for developers on Roblox. But what I don't have respect for is teasing, updates, teasing different features, or having, stuff that's meant to be like a free pass for certain players to access, and then you have it kind of gender locked, so only players who use feminine bodies are typically rewarded for these kind of things. So you could say, well, it's not that deep, they can just use a femme presenting body. But for someone who has, body dysmorphia, who has gender dysphoria, somebody who just wants to present as non-binary or doesn't want to use a female rig, they shouldn't be forced into using a female rig because the items they want to use are locked to only being usable on a skinny, feminine presenting rig. I think that's really harmful, and unfortunately kind of perpetuates this idea that is, present in real worlds, that you have to be a certain body type to have accessibility to things, and that certain body types are oftentimes favoritized, especially in the fashion industry when it comes to clothing. Not to get too into like real life stuff, but have you ever seen like clothing meant for, I would say the typical beauty standard, which I use loosely, but for like skinny, tall women, you'll see that there's so many more clothing options. And then when you get to the plus size category for maybe bigger women or people who have maybe different body sizes, there is a massive lack of different kinds of clothing in those sections that basically, it really shows a favoritism towards the typical beauty standard, which I think is really harmful, especially when that's kind of almost mimicked or mirrored in an online game that's supposed to be, accessible and inclusive and diverse for everybody who plays it, especially when you have kids playing your game who are notoriously, very impacted by the stuff that they engage with online, and it kind of shapes the way that they perceive things and their points of view, especially as they're growing up and learning. But regardless, I'm not trying to get too much into the whole, sociology of body types and stuff like that, right? Because it's going to get into a lot of stuff. But regardless, I certainly do agree with some of these sentiments from players that it is unfair that certain items like the advent calendar don't have accessibility for different types of bodies, and I think it is harmful to the wider community because it tells players that you aren't as important if you use a Masc body. And although that may not be Dressed Impress's intention with these items, I think if we're going to spend a lot of time making these updates, which I have no doubt takes them a ton of time and effort, I don't think it's that bad of a thing to include Masc bodies. If the, update had to come out a bit later, I'm sure people would be more understanding if it meant that everybody can be included, rather than just a select favoritism sort of group of people who adhere by the typical gender stereotypes, and anybody else who uses a Masc body or maybe wants to use a non-binary presentation of themselves, they don't get access to items that they rightfully earned. So regardless, I definitely think it's an important topic to talk about, and I really do hope that Dressed Impress takes the steps to make the whole advent calendar and just items in Dressed Impress, especially things like gloves or hairs or necklaces or glasses, more accessible to different body types, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how you present in a dress-up game. Everybody, regardless of how much the community they represent, whether they're a minority or majority, deserves to have access to free items that are supposed to be accessible to everybody, and people should not be discriminated against because they want to use a Masc body. So anyways, with that in mind, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. How do you think Dressed Impress could fix this? Do you think they should make all the Christmas items accessible to Masc players? Is that too much to ask? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye!